extreme austerity in the financial, particularly the Eurozone debt crisis, extreme policies to keep markets out and to demonize them, finally, unprecedented measures suspending basic civil, political, and socio-economic rights. But of course, the 21st century is also the age of resistance. The occupation of the squares from Tahrir to Taksim to Puerto de Sol to Rio de Janeiro to then Black Lives Matter, Me Too, anti-lockdown protests. In all these cases, people flooded public space to express indignation, anger, lack of trust in government. Now, I had this quite weird, amazing opportunity to observe and participate in many of these events as an accidental politician. After 45 years in London and until recently, the calm environments of the university, that has changed hugely, as you know, everywhere, including here in the Netherlands. I was elected in 2015 Member of Parliament in Athens for the radical left party, Syriza. From a critic of the law, I became a legislator and an ethnographer of politicians. So this talk and 2 or 3 books I have written recently are part of an attempt to make sense of the state we're in and of my experience. Now, I believe that crises bring to the surface the invisible, taken for granted conditions of normal social political life. In the recent crisis, a permanent but little commented upon characteristic of politics became evident. The operation of power combines traditional sovereignty, the traditional characteristics of sovereign power, and biopower, government and governance. Mainstream jurisprudence recognizes and addresses sovereignty and largely ignores biopolitics. However, their joint operation, sovereignty and biopower, often complementary, occasionally antagonistic, cannot be concealed during acute social crises. Because in those acute crises, both sovereign but also biopolitics lose, I think rarely, but they do lose their legitimatory purchase. So let me say a few words, pretty basic and simplistic new words about these types of power, because I need to use them later. I understand sovereignty for the purpose of this talk solely, so don't attack me because you understand sovereignty. We all know what sovereignty is, but from different perspectives. For the purpose of this talk, as a bundle of powers, institutions, and relations, founded on and reproducing social domination. Historically, sovereignty has been personified, and this is a legacy of political theology. The monarch, the monos archon, the sole ruler, is an heir of monotheistic God and gives face, body, and mouth to sovereignty, performing jurisdiction, laws, speech. Sovereignty has 2 aspects in this rather simplistic analysis I'm putting forward. An external, acting as a legal person vis-a-vis other sovereigns, and then domestically, the personification of the sovereign creates an impression of unity that conceals the class, gender, ethnic struggles which fissure the social order. God, king, later nation of people are representatives and metaphors of unity, of the oneness of belonging to the Dutch nation or the English nation or the Greek nation. And they are representatives, as I said, and metaphors of the oneness, of the singularity of belonging, which transforms the divided many into a singularity and turns the multitude into a body politic. To succeed, however, this function must perform and must be performed, staged through inaugurations, coronations, commemorations, pageantries, the prerogatives of death and mercy, sending people to death and then giving mercy. Biopolitics, on the other hand, operates on biological life and has become the perfect companion to neoliberalism. It targets, shapes, and corrects populations and clusters of people to make them healthy, productive, pliant. It disciplines and controls behavior. It is the conduct of conduct, as Foucault put it, with little concern about ideas. In that sense, it makes the critique of ideology, the typical Marxist provision, somewhat redundant. Modeling and focus, statistics and algorithms aim to improve life by controlling the randomness and contingency of a living population. The surplus value extracted from living labor is supplemented by the surplus force extricated from the conduct of the population. Now, political freedoms, legal guarantees, and individual rights emerged in a long series of struggles against the sovereign. The sovereign in law, its language, recognized abstract persons, legal persons with rights, the homo juridicus. The individual with their rights, however, is no longer the main or the only object of power's intervention. The ontological foundation of biopower and neoliberalism is the homo economicus, a subject of interest, not of rights, or not just of rights. Biopolitics targets the population not as a collection of legal persons, but as the sum of economically active agents. A few words now about the state of exception. States often control real or imaginary emergencies, war, revolution, insurrection, coup d'etat, major natural disasters. When the dominant powers lose their ability to neutralize dangers, they often impose or imposed in the past the state of exception and suspend basic liberties and the normal operation of politics. The exception is staged in a sovereign speaks act and a dramatic performance. We have usually a solemn proclamation. The law is being suspended, civil rights are being suspended, often accompanied by soldiers and tanks in the street, boots in the street, as they call it these days, stop and search, road blockades, and curfews in the most extreme cases. The concept of Costas, as we all know, emerged in Roman law, expressed symbolically in Gratian's famous maxim in the Decretum, necessitas legem non not habet. The sovereign assessment that an emergency exists is factual. The suspended law remains in force, but it is not applied. Now, as we all know, Carl Schmitt and Giorgio Agamben have argued at great length that the state of exception, Agamben in particular, is neither a pure juridical state, it means that the law exists but does not apply, nor a pure factual state, because necessity suspends the law. It is about the law, although the decision about necessity is a factual decision. It leads to action that violates legal norms. Fact and law fade into each other. Now, for liberal jurisprudence, this is anathema. Why? Because the Constitution and the rule of law define, demarcate, and limit the operation of state institutions. The law, as we know, deals in texts, procedures, and norms. Life in facts, events, and eventualities. Law, particularly legal adjudication, moves through argumentation and analogy. It follows reason and rules. Everyday life, on the other hand, is not coherent or systematic in any strict way. It occasionally and haphazardly obeys reason. Law is the domain of order, reality of contingency, and often disorder. Making life follow rules, follow the law, is one of the greatest problems in jurisprudence, very important for Kelsen, although not so much in contemporary jurisprudence. And it is codified as the problem of subsumption, how to concretize the rule and apply the rule to the facts, how to pass from the rule and whatever the judge says that the law is to the actual implementation, enforcement of the law. Racine's Firday says in a key passage, I know what is good, I know the law, but I still act badly. As Kierkegaard puts it, when arguments run out, the decision is madness. Now, what I mean with this, that clearly in every decision process and the final decision making, will intervenes between the finding of law and reason, as it were, the legal thing, and the actual act. So you cannot say that decision making, even in a very argumentative and coherent process as is judging, just reason operates. There's always an element of will. And that is something that I discussed at great length in my recent book called The Law of the Judges, or Juristocracy, in which I show how you can actually work out why so many judicial decisions are either conservative or support the capital, and that this is not just about the ideology of the judges. They're bad people, they're conservatives, they're right-wing, and so on. It is also about the nature of the law, but also about the nature of decision-making. But that is something for another day. Now, the state of exception shows this difficulty of moving from law to fact, so combining the two at its purest. Will decision and forceful action violate legal norms? Now, as I said, this is unacceptable for liberals. The answer is either to deny the existence or significance of extra legal force, or to attempt to legalize the exception. Liberal jurisprudence argues that the state of exception, and here I quote from Frankenberg, does not occur, or rather, it must not take place, because its standardization would undermine the very normalcy of the legal system. The alternative is to legalize the exception, and one way is to include provisions authorizing executive extra-legal power in constitutions, laws, human rights treaties. We have Article 48, the famous article of the Weimar Constitution, Article 16 of the French Constitution. They have two terms there, and the French are always multiplied, état d'urgence and état de siège. The 48 of the Greek Constitution states that in case of war, threat against national security or coup d'etat, the cabinet puts into effect the state of siege, establishing martial courts and suspends civil rights. I have experienced this conflation of emergency, exception, and siege in the 1960s Greece when I was a law student, and I don't wish it on anything. Now, the coup d'etat against Erdogan in 2016, which failed, as you remember, was the last of that time. The old-time coup d'etat in Latin America, in Greece, and places like that was to send some elite troops to occupy parliament and the TV station. And then that would lead to the collapse of the government. This does not take place any longer. Erdogan showed it because people also have social media, they have smartphones, and they can be mobilized as Erdogan did. So emergencies, coup d'etat, and exceptions are now adopting what I call a postmodern form, with law as the key component. Now, developments in the United States are very crucial. As it is in many other areas, we live in the aftermath of Liberation Day. So I think, what is happening now, it frees us from many misconceptions. The Supreme Court decided in July 2024, last year, the case of Trump against the United States, which came out of the criminal prosecutions of the then, the former and now president, arising out of the Capitol attacks. The court ruled with a good majority, 6-3, that presidents have absolute immunity from criminal prosecution for official acts and should be free to carry out duties boldly and fearlessly. Trump celebrated the decision as a big win for the Constitution and democracy. As dissented Judge Sonia Sotomayor put it, the majority elevated the president to being a king above the law. I think here we have a simulation of political theology. I mean, a kind of farcical but deadly return almost to theology proper. The medieval Pope, as the representative and apostle of God on earth, could make what is unnatural natural and what is crime a virtue. The president has been given the power to lawfully violate the law. As he tweeted last month, after a federal judge suspended the operation of one of his many executive decrees, he who saves the country does not violate the law, misquoting, by the way, Napoleon. When people argued that the executive should comply with the judiciary's decisions, Vice President Vance quoted President Jackson from 1832. Stand before the country like Andrew Jackson did, Vance urged Trump, and say, the Chief Justice has made his ruling. Now let him enforce it. And I was reminded of Kissinger when, in an early stage of American hostility towards the European Union, when he said, okay, what is this European Union? When I want to talk to the foreign minister, whom do I ring? And when I have a problem with them, where are their tanks? The European Union's tanks. Now we're going to acquire tanks and many other armaments as well. The unitary executive theory promoted by Trump's ideologues claims that the executive should not be bound by Congress, civil service, and the judiciary. Presidents should run federal agencies as they see fit. And this is again what we should see at this moment. The immunity from crime has migrated and has become liberation more or less from all control and accountability, whether judicial or through the executive agencies and the civil service. Now, this legalization of the exception is happening in more muted terms, I think, all over the world. And what I'm going to do now is to examine briefly 3 case studies of this state of exception as it happened in the 3 emergencies that I mentioned earlier. The economy in crisis first. After the collapse of communism, neoliberalism developed a biopolitics of mandatory desire and instant gratification. Working people were integrated into capitalist priorities through conspicuous consumption, easy and cheap loans, rewards for market speculation, rapid increase of property values. You may remember it here as well. People were ringing you up and saying, do you want another credit card? Do you want another debit card? So do you want a mortgage? Do you want a loan? That is what was happening in the early 2000s. The control of conduct took the form of mandatory enjoyment. Every desire could become an entitlement. I want X could become, I have a right to X, and X will be given to me. This type of consumption supposedly linked individual desire, private desire, with economic growth. With the onset of the Eurozone debt crisis, the reform programs imposed on the debtor countries reversed totally these priorities. The injunction enjoy was replaced by the prohibition of pleasure. Public spending cuts, the halving of salaries and pensions, tax hikes, and the retreat of the social state impoverished people. The seeds of the extreme right had been sown already, but clearly at that point started growing menacingly, and now we see the results. Medical metaphors emphasize the biopolitical nature of the policies. The nation is sick. It is in intensive care. These are terms used in Greece, in Portugal, in Spain, in Italy. Austerity rescued the nation's genetic information. People were ordered to limit consumption to help the recovery of social health. Mrs. Thatcher's Tina there is no alternative, was reversed. There are no individuals and families, there is only populations. Now, this is what this policy is a state of exception. This is what applicant trade unions argued in a case brought in the Greek Conseil d'État, later the European Court of Human Rights, and similar, almost identical cases brought in Portugal and Latvia. The argument was that the radical reduction in salaries and pensions and the abolition of labor law protections amounted to constitutional amendment by diktat and therefore violated the Constitution and the European Convention. The Greek government, that was also the case with the Latvian government, hoped to win, arguing exactly the same line, that this is a state of exception. Why? In the politically anomalous post-Civil War Greece, the courts had repeatedly accepted the power of government to impose martial law because of an imaginary communist threat. So the government hoped that the state of exception argument would win the case for them. So both applicants and the defendant state argued this is a state of exception, obviously with different aim in their argument. The court surprised everyone. It dismissed the argument from the state of exception and approved the measures with a double negation around necessity. I quote, "The measures are not inappropriate for the achievement of the identified objects, which is fiscal balance. Furthermore, they cannot be considered unnecessary. They cannot be double negation. They cannot be considered unnecessary. Since the measures were necessary, their effects on the rights of citizens were lawful according to ordinary, not exceptional law. The political decision on the facts created the necessity, determined their normative validity, they were constitutional, and the scope of the acceptable violations of economic and social rights. They were proportional. These are all arguments in the case, but the main reason given is they were necessary. Second case, refugees. On 6 May 2020, thousands of Syrian refugees and migrants, accompanied by special police, were passed by the Turkish authorities to the northeastern Greek border, Turkish-Greek border, in an attempt to enter Greece and the European Union. The Greek authorities responded in kind. They sent elite troops and riot police to deter what they called an invasion, a refugee invasion. And of course, that led to an exchange of volleys and tear gas, leading to many injuries and at least a couple of deaths. Following this, Turkey stated that the Greek state must get rid of its barbarism. It must respect the rights of asylum seekers, not torture and abuse them. The Greek government bounced back. Those condemned by the international community for instrumentalizing human suffering for political expediency are obviously not entitled to teach human rights. Now we know that Erdogan's Turkey is an illiberal democracy. Greece is getting there, but certainly in relation to refugees, the Greek government treats refugees appallingly with murderous pushbacks leading to drownings and death. The worst disaster happened in June 2023 when a boat carrying 700 people, we don't know how many exactly because the boat was sunk, and 650 people at least drowned, with the Greek Coast Guard probably responsible for the sinking. No one yet has been prosecuted, and this, I think, will amount to one of the greatest state crimes of the 21st century. So we have Greece against Turkey, one sovereign accusing another of cruelty and barbarity towards people fleeing war and disaster. Human rights became again, as in the Cold War period, weapons against the enemy. Both sovereigns suspended the law in a limited state of exception, applying to a specific group, migrants and refugees. Now, the law as the language of the sovereign separates insiders from outsiders, legal from illegal, good from bad people. The law creates the illegal alien, about which you have been writing, Leila, so beautifully, the undocumented, the sans-papiers people who in the xenophobic vernacular become bogus refugees, enemy individuals, invaders, and intruders. These pejorative references link the operation of international with domestic sovereignty, as I said earlier, of external frontiers with the internal borders of separation and discrimination. Europe always had its own internally excluded people: Jews, Roma, gays, communists, and many others. Frontiers separate citizens from aliens. Domestic borders create internal displacements. You call it border space zones, a wonderful term there. Migrants are kept out by frontiers and are demonized by borders. So states have devised political, administrative, and legal measures to keep the refugees out, while at the same time boasting about their moral policies of asylum and hospitality. Refugees are declared the ubiquitous enemy of the state. Where does this type of hypocrisy come from? I believe that it is partly, in any case, a symptom of the declining sovereignty of smaller states. The global power finance capital of supranational economic and cosmopolitan institutions, the wars of the great powers have reduced smaller states' international standing. The response of sovereignty's decline on the world stage is to increase the domestic powers and the increase repression. It invents real or imaginary risks and invades and invests in the politics of fear. One way of doing that is by insisting that the bond between nation, state, and citizen is sacred. Nation replaces religion, the state, the church, citizens, the flock, in another, I think, further permutation of political theology. The territory of the nation state was created, apparently, in an original separation from others. This primal separation opens a gap at the heart of the polity, a void where a united people and territory were supposed to be. However, this original unity is imaginary. It did not actually occur. We have here a type of psychoanalytical symptom. The void is occupied by versions of nationalism, which place the nation's beginning in an Edenic period, before memory, when the nation was whole, happy, affluent. Filtered memories, imagined histories, and constructed traditions strengthen this Genesis myth. The repressed void, however, remains. The imagined original integrity, the sacred bond, is threatened by enemies, aliens, and invaders. The arrival of the refugee dents the sacred bond. The state of exception imposed on refugees recalibrates the sovereign's declining power through a theatrical display of its phantasmagoria. Walls, borders, coast guards, special administrative and police personnel and powers have created an arsenal, replicated counterinsurgency and anti-terrorism strategies. The refugee, in that sense, is both the refuge, the reject, and the refuge, the performative savior of the sovereign. Their dramatic exclusion and persecution masks the sovereign's declining dominion. It is not that the sovereign is he who introduces the state of exception in the infamous statement by Carl Schmitt. The refugees in the state of exception, applied to them, to refugees, are used as signs that sovereignty still has power. In the treatment of migrants and refugees, the sovereign exception, however, serves biopower. The applications for political assignments, we know, are personalized legal rights. The government, however, does not treat refugees as homines juridici, persons with rights, but as members of a dangerous group. They are doubly dangerous. They are mobile, like the virus, that was the argument during the pandemic years, and they import viruses and disease. Their dark, third world bodies infect the healthy Europeans. Refugees are either non-subjects or objects. As non-subjects, they're humans, entitled to minimum protection of liberal and refugee law. As objects, they are not entitled to even basic protections, pushbacks, driftbacks, sinking of boats and killing or deprivation of essentials turns them into bare life, another well-known term. This sovereign act in the service of biopolitical controls shows the deep racism of the state. The wars, the pushbacks, deaths, and the camps feed into fears of the population. The retreat of social security is replaced by manic national security. Now, the exceptional measures imposed on refugees target a particular group indefinitely confined to closely policed spaces. The pandemic extended the restrictions to the entire population. Third, herd immunity. I'm sure you remember the term, herd immunity. We had the expression in 2020. It referred to the policy of letting the virus circulate in the community, infect a large number of people, and create immunity for the whole population. There is no better term to describe the operation of biopolitics than the herd. People are bunched together and are subjected to large-scale policies like farm animals. Biopolitics is not concerned, as I said, with individuals and their rights, but with the correction of the group, the cluster, the population. The pandemic suspension of liberties was a prime example of the exception. The measures aimed at radically altering the behavior of the population. Most governments, at some point, adopted the restrictive policies, lockdown, scientists recommended. Our own Boris Johnson followed the herd immunity policy, however, at the beginning and for a long period, and again in the summer of 2021. He ridiculously claimed that we British are freedom-loving people, unlike the Europeans. And this is the reason we're not imposing restrictions, because our people, the free-born Englishman, will not accept these restrictions as the Italians and the French and the Dutch do. As a result, tens of thousands of unnecessary deaths resulted, particularly in older people and in social care settings. Ethnic minority groups bore a disproportionate burden, showing the inequality of vulnerabilities and, of course, of health provision. The attempt to induce health immunity for the herd destroyed the legal immunities, the right to life and health, of many others. Biopolitical balancing puts life on one side and the capitalist profit on the other. The sovereign decides who lives and who dies on the altar of the market. It is a perfect combination of classic sovereignty that takes life, as we know from Foucault's Bon mot, and biopolitics that manages life. The immunization of the herd, the management of life, leads to the loss of immunity, the individual's protection of life and health. In a tragic culmination, biopolitics becomes thanatopolitics. Now, the state of exception, I would argue now, coming towards the end, is the legal component of the security state. This security state has been founded on the retreat of social security and the continuous state-fueled insecurity, and it is the characteristic of the state in the 21st century. Guantanamo Bay-style camps, refugee camps, proliferate all over the world. Linguistic and symbolic overextension has been calling for a war against whatever latest political priorities and expediencies choose. We have wars on drugs, on terrorism, on benefits abuse, on smoking, on obesity, on invading refugees, on benefits abuse, on war culture, on cancel culture, on critical race theory. Governments have created, strengthened, and capitalized popular fears. Michael Hart and Sandro Mechadra have called this type of governance war regime. What are its characteristics? First, the normalization of crisis and the regularization of emergency measures. A security pact has replaced the social contract. The enemy within has been given so many guises that eventually there is no need to point to some identifier of danger before the exceptional measures are imposed upon the population. Every aspect of life, behavior, and identity can turn into an existential threat. The weapons and powers of the war regime are in place and are used against a rolling series of enemies that keep changing. Observe the ease with which solidarity towards Palestinians, the expression of free speech and protest here in Western Europe, in Germany, in Britain, here in Holland, has become a major threat and crime against the state. Not only in the United States, but also here in civilized Europe, in the Europe of the Enlightenment, as we always claim. Yesterday, Germany deported four European citizens to their different countries because they had just protested in relation to Palestine. Second characteristic is that boundaries between state and law have been blurred. Law has been militarized and aligned with the putative needs of national security. The executive, the security agents, the police have been given new and extensive discretionary powers and have been freed from many normal legal restraints because extreme danger cannot be anticipated. Third, state security has mutated in what we can call a hyper-preventative state. Open and covert surveillance and espionage, farming data from social media, targeting potential dissidents and movements with ecological groups at the forefront and pro-Palestinian groups. The principle is that state agents should know the intentions of dissidents in advance and prevent the action before it is taken. It was recently revealed that the Metropolitan Police in London used hundreds of undercover agents who entered left-wing and other radical organizations, spied on them at least 1,000 anti-racist campaigns and groups, with many of the agents developing relations and even acquired families, second families, with members of the groups. This thing became known because a number of women who had given birth with their ex-partner who was a spy, when they realized that, they went out and made public accusations, and now we have this evidence coming out that at least 1,000 groups had been infiltrated by police spies. This wonderful Christian author, Chesterton, in The Man Who Was Thursday, predicted this preventative intervention, which takes us to the kind of Minority Report line. I quote, "The work of the philosophical policeman, is at once broader and more subtle than that of the ordinary detective. The ordinary detective goes to pothouses to arrest thieves. We go to artistic tea parties to detect pessimists. The ordinary detective discovers from a ledger or a diary that a crime has been committed. We discover from a book of sonnets or a critical essay, I would add, that the crime will be committed. We have to trace the origins of those dreadful thoughts that drive men on at last to intellectual fanaticism and intellectual crime." This is exactly what the Metropolitan Police were doing. Those spies, I think, they should be properly called philosophical policemen following Chesterton. Finally, the hyper-preventative security state includes the censorship of critical and dissident speech, the suppression of dissent, and the repression of dissidents. The suspension of politics during the pandemic was utilized to increase the banning and regulation of protests. 2 new public order acts were passed in Britain during the pandemic lockdown, and the same happened in many European countries. I do recall some of these cases in that little book. The restricted state of exception imposed on refugees and the general population in the pandemic helped build this counterinsurgency arsenal, which has become normal policy. Now let me finish with some jurisprudence. We're in a center that develops legal theory and history, so I want to finish with the jurisprudence of exception. In the US, the concept of the political question, and the political question is also a concept that's used in European legal systems, domestic systems, and of course in Britain, the concept of the royal prerogative. These are concepts that stop the judicial review of crucial governmental decisions, usually in defense and foreign relations, but not just that. So in cases when the royal prerogative is being argued by the government, or the political question by the United States federal government, judges refuse to examine the constitutionality mainly of the executive action and affirm the primary of politics. The politicians must decide, and we're staying away. Now, in the economic crisis case law that I mentioned earlier, the judges did not exercise this self-restraint, although it was precisely what the government was asking them to do. They adopted the concept of necessity, legalized it, and used it to approve the executive decision. So necessity, rather than stopping them from reviewing the government, allowed them to actually review the government, use necessity, and say everything is absolutely fine. This legalization allowed them to avoid resorting to the gray zone of the state of exception or the state of siege with all its paraphernalia. Necessity was placed within the law and became part of its normality. This way, a gap opens between the concept of necessity and the regime of the state of necessity or the state of exception. The determination of necessity, an act of political will, and the determination of fact, not of legal reason, became the normality of the crisis and prevented the suspension of the constitutional order. So the state of exception has been transformed into legalized necessity. It is a response, I think, of the inability of liberal law and jurisprudence to accommodate the violence it presides over, a central characteristic of late capitalism and its politics of fear. This legalization is a fig leaf covering the limitations and fears of the ruling powers. Legalized necessity compensates for cognitive and political deficiencies. The state of exception no longer threatens but serves liberal law as a legalized necessity. But of course, the people heard in exactly the same way. In the economic crisis, necessity destroyed people's living standards and life. In the pandemic, health necessity decided that people should not leave home, should not work or meet with others. Refugees are the hinge between the economic and the pandemic, representatives of the permanent dangers that surround and threaten us. We don't live, therefore, in a state of a permanent state of exception, as the Agamemnians argue, a state of exception that formally suspends the law. Tanks in the streets is too dramatic a denial of the rule of law. We live in a state of permanent legalized necessity that can be pulled out at any moment, and it is being pulled out at any moment at brief notice without all this huge kind of paraphernalia of the state of exception. But resistance did not stop did not stop even in the pandemic. The early protests in 2020 went global at the end of the year, to 2020, and through 2021 and 22. As the governments kept piling and using the weapons, the legal weapons of the war regime, resistance took on new forms. Now, of course, we cannot protect ourselves from biopower using exclusively the legal rights created to limit sovereignty. Legal rights, human rights were created against sovereignty in many struggles and bloody struggles, but they were rights against sovereignty, as quite rightly, I think, here liberal jurisprudence claims. Legal rights anyway, in most of these cases, were suspended. They did not exist. We could not use them. Dissidents, I believe, used a different form of right, distanced both from sovereignty and biopolitical controls. It does not emerge in the interstices of the relationship between sovereign and citizen. It surfaces when the people express their independence and solidarity beyond the prescribed limits of acceptable freedoms. Now, what common characteristics do resisting people have in these circumstances? We are all governed. We are all ruled by governments. This common condition founds a different type of right when the government fails. We call it a right, lacking an alternative term. It is not a legal or moral right. I would call it a biopolitical right, because these rights come into existence when people declare they do not want to be ruled or governed in such an excessive or wrong manner and act accordingly. They are rights of the ruled, of the governed, grounded on their solidarity and independence. Now, of course, as I said, biopolitics manages life and controls behavior. Biopolitical rights resist the behavior demanded by power. They are, in that sense, the rights of the rightless at that point. These rights emerge and survive through their own affirmation. They are not primarily grounded on norms or ethics. However, I believe that they're not totally normatively unmoored. Dissidents reserve and co-opt the state's biopolitical operation. Post-war governments promise to protect the life and the health of the population. As life becomes the target of biopower, dissidents use their own life to undermine it. Life itself becomes the weapon and stake of resistance. Let me give you a few examples. The amazing migration waves that are been happening and continue throughout the 21st century challenge sovereignty, directly placing on the line the fragility of life and the possibility of death. In all those little boats that start in Libya or in Egypt or in Turkey and move over to the Mediterranean, the Aegean, turning quite often into floating coffins and turning the Mediterranean into a cemetery. This is also the case when refugees protesting their long arbitrary detention show their lips or eyes, undertake long hunger strikes, or seek shelter from deportation in churches and places of worth. As Atkins and Pinfat put it, the refugees shown muteness, deafness, and blindness shows that our way of life is indeed all we have left under sovereign power. Refugees embrace bare life as their main tool of resistance. Such rights sustain the pandemic protests or the students setting up camps protesting the Palestinian genocide. Such are the rights when people rise up against government negligence, against government corruption, which leads to loss of life, as it has been happening over the last month or so in Serbia and in Greece. These resistances emerge and survive through their own affirmation. We don't know when the next Tahrir or Taxi or Black Lives Matter will erupt, but we know it will. This is our hope in this dark times. Thank you.
Costas, this is very powerful. I'd like to give the floor to Hans Lindahl for comments.
Can you hear me without microphone? Is it okay? Or would you want?
If you could just turn it on, because for the
Okay.
in the interest of people at home.
Oh yeah, it's now.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, that's right. People behind us.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks so much for such an inspiring presentation, and thanks for an incredible book. I think I can't imagine a more topical book in the dystopian times that we're living today. I had originally thought of commenting on the state of exception as you presented in this book, and precisely because I think that you make an important step forward in referring to it not so much as a state of exception, but as a state of legalized necessity. I think that that's crucial to making sense of the contemporary dystopian situation. And I was very tempted to do so in terms of the discussions about illegality and so forth, but I will not do so, because I think that what's even more important in your book is, in a certain sense, the last chapter. The last chapter has as its title the desire called utopia. And what I think very important in this last chapter is that you pick up on the thread of arguments that you developed in your 2000 article, Human Rights and Postmodern Utopia. And in a certain sense, you reaffirm the key ideas presented in that paper 25 years later with what has happened since 2000 to today. And so the question that I want to raise, and it's not critical, it's an invitation to think further with you about this topic, is how to understand the relationship between praxis and utopia against the background of a legalized state of necessity. And it seems to me that this is what is ultimately at stake in your book, a very how can I put it, very sober analysis of the legalization of the state of necessity. But the book ends on a note of hope. And what interests me here is, amongst others, the notion of desire. I'll come back to that at the end of my presentation. But I view desire from the more general perspective, not merely as a psychoanalytical notion, but in terms of the notion of praxis, and how praxis, we should understand the relationship of praxis to utopia in the face of a situation of legalized necessity. You call it, in your 2000 article, postmodern, this desire. I wonder if we would not perhaps speak or should speak of two readings of modernity. I would want to defend a certain understanding of modernity. And if what is at stake in our contemporary dystopia is legalized necessity, then the reason for calling it, in a certain sense, a second reading of modernity is that I think that what is at stake at its core in the notion of modernity, philosophically speaking, and many of the institutions of modernity, is the experience of radical contingency, which modernity inherits from the crisis of scholastic philosophy, and in particular nominalism. And here I'm following the work of Hans Blumenberg, and in particular his extraordinary book called The Legitimacy of the Modern Age. And here he's engaging, amongst others, of course, with Schmitt and the secularization theorem, but he's also engaging in a more subterranean manner with Heidegger, and more generally, therefore, with the theory of secularization. And what's at stake, according to Blumenberg, in the notion of radical contingency? In a certain sense, what the notion of power was, how it was conceptualized in scholastic philosophy, was a process of trying to maximize the power of God at the expense of human being. Potentia absoluta, and finding in the death throes of nominalism and therefore of scholastic philosophy, was a process of sort of rethinking the very notion of power in a way which would have been inconceivable for Greek philosophy. Greek philosophy, you think of Aristotle, of course, had the notion of the unmoved mover, but that is extraordinarily different from the notion of the potentia absoluta of divine power. Why? Because what was at stake in the notion of radical contingency as sharpened in scholastic philosophy was not only the notion of contingency, and here's where the problem of necessity comes into the picture. It was not merely contingency in the sense of things could be otherwise, but it was more radical in the sense of there could be nothing. That is to say, that without the continued concursion or the maintenance of existence, of the world in existence through God, if he, with a capital H, withdrew his support of the world, reality would fall back into the need. And so in a sense, this was the radical form of contingency that we inherited from the scholastic period. Leibniz, of course, gave the key formulation of this. Why something rather than nothing? This was a question that would have been impossible to ask within Greek philosophy. And so what radical contingency meant at the outset of modernity was the fact that not only could the world be otherwise, but that the world could also fall back into the abyss of the nothing. And that at the end of the day, this world had become completely unreliable for human being, epistemically, but also praxically, if I can put it that way, that it was an oppressive reality, or to the extent that reality was oppressive, then basically we have to get rid of the idea of God as supporting the world. We have to take responsibility for transforming the world in such a way that becomes amenable to human life. Thesis 11. Thus far, philosophers have interpreted the world. What is at stake is changing it, praxis. And therefore, what is at stake in the transition from medieval to modern philosophy is a reappropriation. Bloomberg will speak about reoccupation of the problematic of radical contingency to give way to a new notion of praxis. And that new notion is what Descartes in the Meditations, or our good friend Hobbes in the Leviathan, or in the Kibe actually, would call self-conservation or self-preservation. And that notion is, as it were, the common thread that takes us, beginning with Descartes and the hypothesis of the malin génie, all the way into, beyond Marx, into many ways, many lines of contemporary thinking, practical thinking. Perhaps the most clear formulation of what is at stake in how to deal with the problem of contingencies to be found in Kant, and in particular in the groundwork, and the notion, therefore, of praxis as becoming autonomous, emancipation. And if you remember in the groundwork, Kant refers to two specific moments of freedom, of autonomy. On the one hand, a first destructive moment, if you can call it that way, where what presents itself as being necessary, a situation of oppression, legalized necessity, becomes therefore rendered contingent, and becoming contingent, then it becomes amenable to transformation in a way that makes human life livable, and that would actually generate a form of necessity, which is a humanized understanding of what necessity is about. That's taken up again in Marx in his notion of praxis, which also has two dimensions. You'll remember, of course, the first chapter of Capital and the critique of the fetish. And in a sense, what Marx is to show that there is a situation of, in a way, a form of necessity, a false necessity, that what a critique is supposed to do is to puncture that condition of necessity and reveal it for a contingent state of affairs, which could be transformed in a way that would lead us into, positively speaking, a condition of communism. So if Kant begins with that negative moment of freedom, disclosing what seemed to be necessary, yet oppressive, as being only contingent and therefore giving way to a creative process, human process of universalization, think of the categorical imperative, that returns in Marx by way of the notion of praxis as a revolutionary praxis that creates communism, and therefore, in fact, utopia, in a modern understanding, or in one reading of modernity, is that process, that emancipatory process, an emancipation of humanity as such, which leads us ultimately, even if Marx doesn't use this terminology, to something like reciprocal recognition of all of members of humanity as free and equal beings. And so in a sense, what the trajectory is about in this reading of Utopia is the passage from a false necessity, which is discovered as contingency, to then a creative process, a practical project, which leads through a revolutionary praxis into a condition of the kingdom of freedom, that is to say, a condition of properly human autonomy, of all as being free and equal beings. And that would be precisely the state, the real state of necessity. In a Kantian understanding, that would still be an idea. That is the aspiration of utopia, that is the desire of utopia, but it is a desire that is indeterminate in terms of when it would actually arrive. So it becomes an idea in the sense of something that we aspire to, that we desire, but in a certain sense is always postponed in real life. But it gives a trajectory and a meaning to human history. What are the implications of this understanding of utopia and of praxis? Praxis as the process of emancipatory process oriented to realizing utopia. Well, the first implication is that it's about overcoming contingency, an initial condition of contingency. Even if it's postponed, at least in principle, the telos of praxis is to overcome contingency and create a humanized understanding of the necessary society. In a certain sense, this is a reoccupation, of course, of the old scholastic doctrine of the transcendentals. Ens et unum et verum et bonum convertutur. That's a first implication. A second implication is to understand that process of revolutionary practice as not only the unification beyond the distortions, ideological distortions, of what presents itself as universal, but is actually only a partial interest. So a unification that understands itself also as a process of ongoing totalization. A third implication that follows from this is that if praxis is at the core of politics, and if politics is oriented towards realizing a total collective in the sense of an all-encompassing collective, which would in fact mean that all members of humanity could recognize themselves and each other as equal and free beings, then that means that it's actually, at the end of the day, politics to end politics, even if the end of politics in the double sense of the term has to be postponed indefinitely in human history. And finally, a fourth implication is that utopia is, in a certain sense, if it begins as legalized necessity, in a certain sense, it's nowhere, precisely because it's legalized in a way that closes down all horizons of possibility and makes the present into something which is, in a certain sense, unbearable. And I think that for many of us, the experience of what we're living now is how unbearable it is to imagine a continuation of where we now sit. So if the passage, the structure, the relationship with praxis and utopia is taking us from nowhere to everywhere. So utopia, in a certain sense, if it's, spatially speaking, if it's nowhere in a situation of legalized necessity, then it's everywhere if praxis has succeeded in creating a human society where beings are free and equal everywhere. Now, this is one reading of what modernity is about. And what I read Costas is doing is, on the one hand, trying to hold on to the utopian moment of the notion of praxis. But on the other hand, when referring to it as postmodern, he's also introducing some nuances, which I would agree with, and which I think are very important, but maybe I'm reading something into Costas which is not in Costas, so it's as much an attempt on my own to try to recover a certain understanding of the relationship between praxis and utopia, as it is an attempt to enter into conversation with Costas about this. Now, what would be the typical issues that this understanding of the relationship with praxis and utopia might raise? In some ways, I would guess that Horkheimer and Adorno would say that, well, it becomes a dialectic. That in the very process of becoming emancipatory, becoming utopian, it becomes also dystopian. And that would be one way of putting it. Another way, perhaps, would be the way of Laclau. If this understanding of praxis aims at unification as totalization, then perhaps the big problem here is its difficulty in making sense of radical alterity. The other and the strange is simply the not yet us. And so what you get is a situation of forgetfulness about a constitutive outside that resists assimilation into any specific legal order. And precisely because this other reading of unification as totalization seems to claim universality for itself, whoever would resist will in fact be subhuman or non-human. The contemporary name of that is, of course, a terrorist. A third difficulty here is that I think that there is from a phenomenological perspective, the structure of praxis is a structure of intentionality. Not intentionality necessarily in the Husserlian sense of epistemic intentionality, but more a praxical understanding of intentionality, a la Merleau-Ponty, in some ways a la Heidegger. What will be at stake here? Intentionality says that something appears as this or as that against the background of a pre-given and co-given world. Now, in saying that something appears or that you disclose something as this or as that, it means that to disclose it as this, you do not disclose it as that. So that there's necessarily a moment of exclusion involved in the very process of unification, which explains why there is a constitutive outside in any attempt to unify, and certainly also to unify as totalization. What does that mean in terms of recognition? Because I said that in contemporary conceptual frameworks, that moment of utopia, in that strong sense, would be the possibility for all humans to recognize themselves and each other as free and equal beings. The implication of this structure of intentionality is that we are always more and other than ourselves. That is to say that we have to recognize ourselves as individuals in the stories that we tell about ourselves. And also as collective, in the sort of narratives that we tell about ourselves as a collective. We recognize ourselves, identify ourselves in one way or another, and in that very process also misrecognize ourselves to the extent that we are more and other than any single narrative we could tell about ourselves. Which means, therefore, that there is no recognition without misrecognition. No unification without pluralization. No identification, no self-identification without self-differentiation. This, of course, is what Derrida would call différence. And here's where then I'm interested to see if Costas would agree with me, or perhaps there might be some differences. This is then, I think, what I would want to reappropriate his claim as being the post-human understanding of utopia. There remains a relationship between utopia and praxis. But what's interesting in what Costas is doing here is not taking on board the whole notion of praxis in that first modern sense of it, but focusing particularly on the moment of resistance. Because to focus on that moment of resistance is to focus on what Kant, coming back to what I had said, would call that first negative moment of autonomy. Somewhere in the book, Costa says, the most interesting understandings of negativity are the negative of utopia are the negative utopias. That is to say that universality should be viewed not so much as a positive reality, the possibility of actually realizing an all-encompassing legal order, but rather the fact that it is a certain way of saying nothing of what exists is necessary. And therefore, it's sort of an antidote to legal necessitation as the core of the state of exception, without trying to say in advance where it might lead something like an act of resistance to the claimed necessity of what exists. Now, if that is the case, and if we're in agreement there, then what that means is something actually quite interesting for the theory of utopia. I said that in the first modern reading of it, that means that you go from nowhere, because reality is oppressive, there is no exit. And then you have an exodus, if I may use the term, of heart and negri into everywhere. And what I think Costas is trying to argue here is that at stake in resistance is not so much to show that you actually have a story about that would apply everywhere, but rather to say utopia is elsewhere. It's not here. We don't have a positive image of where utopia is. Let's just get started by saying it's elsewhere than here. And what I think is very important there then is to accept that there's not so much the emancipation of humanity, but there are human emancipations in the plural. That resistance is always concrete, situated. And because it's always situated, it, in a sense, cannot but also reappropriate that oppressive past which it wants to liberate itself from in the very process of trying to deal with it. And so there are emancipations rather than emancipation in the singular. Put it another way, there are perspectives on humanity, but not the perspective of humanity. And that further implication of that is then therefore that this would be the second reading of modernity, which I would certainly endorse, and I'm interested in hearing if Costas would. It would be an understanding of the relationship between praxis and utopia that understands utopia as negative, as elsewhere, which means then that it cannot be a politics to end politics, but the insistence on the irreducibility of politics, precisely because we can never be sure that we have been able to move beyond oppression, our own oppression in claiming to be integrative or unifying with respect to what resists us. And then, if that is the case, how do you relate that first reading of modernity to the second reading of modernity? How can you, in a certain sense, hold on to the desire called utopia, and at the same time acknowledge the fact that it will never be reached, and that if we accept that, if we think that it will be reached, that we're already on our way to totalitarian? My proposal would be to say that we need to draw a strong, sharp distinction between wholeness and unity. I would argue that no legal order can understand itself other than as a unity. And that what law is ultimately about, and these are some of the issues that you were discussing today, the problem of sovereignty is at the end of the day that moment of decision, and certainly in form of a state of exception, which is always there latent, where you say, this is unity. Ultimately, this is what we are about. Here are the boundaries of what defines us as a collective. But of course, that moment of decision inevitably has a moment of violence. And so what we would call the desire for utopia is an unquenchable desire for wholeness, which is incongruous with unity. A legal order, a political legal order, cannot exist other than as claiming to be a unity, and therefore to exercising at the end of the day the possibility of the state of exception in this sense of decisionistic sense of it, the term. But at the same time, what makes possible a relationship between praxis and utopia that does not collapse into an apology of legal necessity is precisely an unquenchable desire for wholeness beyond the possible, beyond unity. Thanks very much.
I'm going to get Costas to
Yes, of course. Let me first correct what I said about Heinz at the very beginning. I said that he's one of the most important legal philosophers. He's clearly one of the most important philosophers. He read my article of 25 years ago, and I first heard him speak at Birkbeck College. When was that? I mean, towards the end of the 20th century?
No, that was in 1850.
But it was sometime, perhaps, the end of the beginning of the 21st century, where he introduced the ideas that the first part of his talk today developed much further. Ideas about the nihil, the nothing, about the causa sui, God as creating ex nihilo, and of course the major debate between Smith, Blumenberg, and Lois. I don't remember you mentioned Lois, but in the major debate about what is modernity. And this is, it seems to me, Hans's work ever since, trying to put the different parts of legal practice, legal philosophy, and of course political practice into that narrative about modernity and what is modernity, and whether we have a second modernity, there is a post-modernity, or what is the question of modernity that modernity poses, because that was the stake of a debate between Heidegger, Blumenberg, Smith in between, and Lois. Does modernity start totally anew, or does it repeat a question that was posed in the medieval world, and it just tries to answer the same question, but slightly different? That is the Blumenberg position. I remember that when I first heard Hans, I was not aware of that debate. But then I became quite immersed in it, and actually one of my PhD students is just finishing an absolutely amazing doctorate, and now I know who's going to be the external examiner, but that is by the by. So, the Hans' intervention in terms of this debate, for me, late scholasticism and the nominalist tradition is absolutely important, because it seems to me that all the major characteristics of the modern political regime are found more or less in Duns Scotus and William of Ockham. Of course, there were theologians, now we're talking about politicians, but the omnipotence of the sovereign, the importance of the individual, the fact that we do not have systemic or structural characteristics, but individuals, and this is the importance, of the, in the theological sense of the scholastic tradition today, what we call, the individuals is what counts. And all these are ideas that, Hans, for me anyway, worked with and spoke about well before I was into that kind of theoretical philosophical approach. They've been extremely important for me in my work, not so much in this book, although I think Hans, in the best way of the Gadamerian, what is the term? The benign interpreter, or so the good interpreter, reads into my work, many of which I was not aware. But of course, what does that mean? Once you've published an article, a book, made a film, it has, in a sense, raised its anchor, and it is sailing. And everyone has the right and the power to interpret it in the way they see fit. And the author, the only thing that the author can say, if Hans Jacob tells me what we're saying is totally wrong, I say, the only thing that I have some kind of authority is to say, I'll tell you what, when I was writing this thing, I was going through a period of depression or a period of huge joy. In other words, talk about my biography rather than try to say, because I'm the author, I know what it means. So in that sense, Hans's interpretation of my work within the context of this great debate about modernity, I find one of the greatest honors that I've had, and I have to respond immediately. I mean, obviously, will there be a video of this presentation? Will there be a video, or is it just live streamed?
It's live streamed.
Will there be a video that I can listen again?
Yeah, I'm recording this.
Oh, lovely. Okay, good. So, I will read it and link it up with the questions, or rather the interpretation Hans, about modernity, about the huge influence of the medieval theological tradition upon modernity, about Leibniz and this idea of the best of all possible worlds, or the even greater idea, perhaps one of our greatest problems, that everything has a reason. That is the key Leibnizian answer to this. Everything has a reason. And in a sense, it is an answer to the nominalist tradition as translated into political theology, for which, of course, reason always follows will. I mean, Thomas Aquinas tried to create a kind of, an answer to the dilemma, the conundrum that Hans was talking about, the relationship between an omnipotent God and a rational Aristotelian God. How do you combine those two? And it was the last attempt within the Catholic theology to try the combination. After that, we have nominalism basically, and Hobbes, and Descartes. Descartes, a key nominalist also, said that if God said 2 and 2 equals 5, that is what it happens. If God says that adultery is a virtue and not a vice, that would be fine, something that many of us would approve. But anyway, that's a different question. So what did Aquinas try to do? He said, of course, there is God's will, and God's will is absolutely, sort of primary. But God decides with his power and his will to follow reason in the way he organized the world, and therefore we can work out the natural law that exists in society. But this is the last attempt. After that, the primacy of will, of act, of decision takes on. I don't know if you agree with that, but absolutely. Yeah. So, in a sense, trying to answer to that wonderful and rich commentary of Hans, I'm going back to my own, as it were, obsessions, about the relationship between Aristotelian rationalism and scholastic primacy of will. In order to come, I suppose, and finish at the last point, the desire called utopia. I mean, those of you who know the work of Hans is always playing with this relationship between negativity and positivity, between action and reception, between the positive and the negative, in the way that there is always that kind of negativity before every positivity. There is always a kind of formal or institutional, sort of conformity before we go out in the world and, we act and, sort of we think that we bring something new. And as he mentioned, in the general mind, utopia is connected with constitutional designs. From Thomas More all the way to the great 19th century utopians, Owens, Saint-Simon, and so on. They all try to work out, sort of the perfect constitution. And this is exactly something that has repeatedly failed in the few attempts which put utopian schemes into operation. It reminds me very much a point that I'm making elsewhere about justice. The theories of justice and thinking about justice is the oldest failure of human thought. It starts with the Old Testament, then moves into the Republic of Plato, and goes all the way to Rawls and Dworkin and whoever, Sandel, whoever doing today. Every theory of justice has failed. However, we know injustice when we come across it. There is a wonderful idea that we understand injustice. We immediately, Rousseau in Emile says that about the kid. The kid realizes, sort of that something is unjust that happened to him in the garden. But the theory of justice has failed. And in a sense, this is what brings me into what I call the desire of utopia, which precisely, as Hans put it, negative in relation to the world we live in. it is negative. It starts from saying, this is not good. And if that this is not good becomes enough is enough, which becomes quite regularly these days, then you move into resistance. And in that, I follow very closely, and I think it's absolutely wonderful, though not very much used in legal scholarship, the work of Ernst Bloch, the great messianic Marxist, a fellow traveler of Benjamin. Benjamin is better known. And of course, towards the end, I think Hans, in a sense, alluded to Benjamin, sort of the idea how for Benjamin, the state of exception, we live here, sort of talking about Nazi Germany, the interwar period, is dreadful. What we need to do is to put together the real state of exception, the real state of exception, which, however, for Benjamin, perhaps in his more Marxist, less messianic kind of trend, was a kind of design for the future. But in the Blochian, his fellow traveler, tradition, both in his wonderful book, Natural Law and Human Happiness, I think, and of course in the 3-volume Principle of Hope, is a collection of what we can call utopian fragments. Utopian fragments that you find in the middle of life, and she uses all sorts of things, from obviously what we would call today the stories of the refugees that tell to people like Leila, and Leila collects them and puts them out. The stories of people, who leave their country, go through, murderous, frontiers and huge the difficulties and so on, and eventually arrive something, and they then narrate it. But not only that, I mean, Bloch would go into festivals and carnivals and dreams and even advertising. Because what he says, advertising, that kind, every type of futurity that appears even, momentarily in the present, opens a different vista. It is the present, the future in the present, not the future design, constitution, totality of a state in the Hegelian sense, but that pool of desire, that thing that makes me, even in the darkest hour, see and hear and dream of something that is to come, is avenir, does not exist, but makes the present pregnant with that hope, with that desire. And these are maybe, sort of very humble and small and little happiness and events and dreams and stories and desires. But these are the things that by precisely, on the one hand, remembering the past, and on the other hand, escaping in a future that exists in the present, though, in the present, not in some future organized utopia, I think help us survive and even hope for a better time. And in that sense, resistances and the fact that they have been returning, you see, all these laws and states of exception and public order laws and anti-protest laws and the deportation of people protesting for Palestine and so on. This is what laws do. This is what laws do. Law and political power, I suppose, both bans resistance and also declares that resistance is futile. It does not exist. And then keeps coming back. I mean, like the repressed, it never stops from coming back. And this coming back, this return, this eternal return, you could even say, of the future in the present that redeems the past, to put it in a sentence that brings together, Benjamin, Bloch and Hans Lindahl, the future in the present that redeems the past. It's precisely, I think, what we see today in small and larger events around the world. And this is extremely hopeful. I mean, I in politics, I try to do things, and then I realized how politics always fails, even when it has the best intentions. And the government that I was elected for was the only radical left government in Western Europe, I don't know, since ever. And we saw it. I saw it, sort of at very close distance, that we could not do much. That you were totally surrounded, both by the European powers and the IMF, but also by the domestic powers that be, that had made it absolutely imperative that this government should fail, and it did fail. But in this failure, for example, dealing with refugees, and I hear that both you, Shahin, and Leila have been to Lesbos, and a very difficult situation. That government, we had probably more than 1 million people pass through Greece, not a single person died. And we had the Pope, we had the General Secretary of the United Nations, we had all kinds of dignitaries come to Greece, to this little country, little people, and even smaller party that had actually done its duty towards those people. And that for me, remains as the greatest, as it were, achievement of my life. That, sort of in those few months, when suffering humanity started coming in droves, to our little islands and so on, we said, we're here, and we want to help. Now, these are for me the kind of utopian moments in which, without grand statements and declarations, you just answer to the suffering other. And I finish on this. In one of his wonderful, I think, and well-structured presentations, Hans used the idea of totalization, which comes obviously from Hegelian dialectic, is also the Horkheimer in the essay on critical theory and so on, the totalizing thing. And the postmodern, what I use the term postmodern in that area period, now postmodern has become a dirty word, so we don't use it anymore so much, was that attempt that for me started with reading and understanding the work of Manuel Levinas, but then of course Derrida, the late Derrida, totally, I think, incorporated that Levinasian approach. And what does that mean? That every totalization that is outside of the totalization, what cannot be totalized is the face of the other who in pain, who turns to me and says, save me, give me shelter, give me food, don't let me die. And that kind of face in pain is precisely the foundation of all ethics and even of all ontology, although of course Levinas would be against that. Because when Hans mentions the idea of recognition of course comes from the Hegelian tradition, and again is a tradition of totalization. Obviously Hans talks about misrecognition also. But the face of the other as part of who I am, as part of the other who comes to me, and by saying to me, save me, in the same way that my mother called me Costas and put me in the huge archive of language, in other words, that the other comes always before me, that always in medias res, and that therefore who I am is always hostage to who comes before me both temporally, but also in front of me, and tells me, save me. And before I decide whether to save or not, I have to decide whether to answer or not. There is a previous question, do I answer to the other who turns to me? In that answer to the other who turns to me, the whole, I think, question of ethics lies, and this is an ethics that brings with it this idea of utopia. Because while ethics and legal order and human rights talk about dignity, talk about respect, talk about the Kantian tradition, utopia speaks about something else, speaks about a happiness that's not given to us. We will never have happiness. We will never have a happy society. We will never have, obviously, a totalized society. But the face of the other and my response to her, the other in pain, is precisely what allows us to say, yes, I am here, I am for you, and I understand and accept that it is you, the other, who comes before me, that makes me who I am. Thank you.
So I propose a 5-minute break. Everyone can stretch your legs and we can regroup.
I think
So I think also Costas are in the room. If you want to sit here. Yes. So welcome back, everyone. So our second part of this session will commence with Firday, who defended her fantastic dissertation yesterday, also with Costas in the committee. And here she will talk about the dissertation in the context of the seminar. So I'd like to give her the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jacob. Good morning. It's still morning, everybody. Thank you for being here today. I would like first to thank you, Jacob, for facilitating this event. Really, thank you. And I would like to particularly thank All Sport Center for it to have become my home in the past 6 years. And I really hope that it remains my home in the coming years. I would like also to thank my great supervisors for being with me in this journey. I feel very honored and also privileged to have the space to talk about my research the day after my defense. That is unique. I would like also to thank Hans Lindahl for accepting our invitation to be in this panel. And I would like to particularly thank Costas Douzinas for being in my committee, for actually being one of my great intellectual heroes and an example, obviously, for me. And, I want to connect my talk to the last point that you made in the previous part of this session, that you actually talked about thinking about justice and theorizing justice as one of the biggest failures of human being. That actually reminds me of a very memorable memory that I have from you some 7-8 years ago, that I was in London attending your seminars on human rights in Birkbeck College, where actually you started the course with saying that we might not know what justice is, but we definitely know what injustice is, and that the task of a critical legal thinker is to unravel instances and structures of injustice and to find a way to resist them. This was actually one of my main motivations to write a PhD thesis on the topic of undocumented migrants and the way that their exploitation and exploitability becomes normalized under law, but particularly human rights law. And there actually we come with that idea of human rights being also sometimes hypocrite, promising justice, promising protecting everybody, but at the same time facilitating and normalizing their exposure to violence and exploitability. And because of that, I have actually decided to title my presentation today "From Exceptionalism of Status Regularization to Normalization of Labor Dispossession," because in my thesis, I argued that labor dispossession is the logic and the structure that stands behind legal mechanisms that expose, in the end, undocumented migrants to conditions of severe exploitability that I believe are very much similar to instances and the structures of modern slavery under the promise of abolition and absolute prohibition of slavery under EU human rights regime. Well, as I said, my PhD research is a legal philosophical investigation into the role of the European human rights regime in normalizing legal structures that expose undocumented migrants to severe exploitation. My specific focus in this research has been on analyzing the logic and functioning the EU human rights regulations that govern residence and labor relation of undocumented migrants within the broader context of the political economy of irregular migration under global capitalism and the market's increasing demand for cheap labor. The central argument of my thesis is that the current European human rights framework is incapable of addressing the problematic of undocumented migrants' structural exposure to exploitability in their everyday lives and labor relations. As an alternative, I argue for disentangling undocumented migrants' right to work from their residence status, an ideal that could be pursued through the unionization of undocumented migrant workers in post-slavery Europe. To illustrate the foundations of this argument concisely, I outline two preliminary points without going into detail. First, the exceptionalism of regularization. The European Human Rights Framework restricts the legal pathways for residence regularization to highly exceptional cases, also very much based on the logic of victim-based humanitarianism and compassion at the mercy of the states. This limitation results in the creation of a category of non-deportable illegalized migrants, individuals who are neither granted legal status, the precondition for their access to normal life and secure labor relations, nor are they deported, effectively trapped in a legal limbo where they lack access to rights, basic rights, but most importantly, in the context of my analysis, the right to work. The second point is the legalization and hence normalization of labor dispossession. And that is basically about the fact that the European regime systematically deprive non-deportable migrants of the right to work. This is achieved through legalization and in some cases criminalization of their employment under the EU Sanction Directive, and the reinforcement and normalization of this illegalization through the ECTHR, the European Court of Human Rights, interpretation of Article 4 that promises absolute prohibition of slavery, servitude, and forced labor. By legally incapacitating undocumented migrants from engaging in valid and durable employment relations, this system entrenches their vulnerability and facilitates their exploitability as cheap and disposable labor forces. In this talk, I focus on one specific part of my analysis that explains how the functioning of EU human rights regulation, which illegalizes the employment of undocumented migrants, can be understood through the logic of dispossession. And I would like to emphasize that this is something that I'm going to work on more in my future research, hopefully. Based on this explanation, I argue that talking about or understanding the logic behind illegalization of undocumented migrants' employment based on this idea of dispossession could actually help us have legally grounded and morally enriched arguments for disentangling the right to work of undocumented migrants from the residence status. Here, let me provide a brief fact-based context. Estimates indicate that of the minimum 3.5 million undocumented migrants residing in Europe, approximately 70% of them are employed in sectors such as construction, food production and processing, hospitality, and domestic work. These workers constitute the backbone of the labor force in these industries, which are characterized by persistent demand for low-wage labor, but at the same time having weak labor protections and regulations, obviously. It might be interesting to mention that according to the recent study of Hein de Haas, a migration scholar who is very well known in the Netherlands, both regular and irregular labor migration to Europe has steadily increased from the 1970s to present. This trend is driven by the persistent and even growing demand for migration labor in migrants' labor in precarious sectors, the one that I just referred to. Well, while the availability of such employment opportunities partly explain why individuals migrate and then remain in Europe on an illegal ground, it cannot explain that why they are constantly exposed to exploitability and in many cases are subjected to exploitability despite the European human rights regime promise to protect everyone against undignified life condition, but most importantly, to protect everybody against slavery, servitude, and forced labor. To explain this, Liberal migration scholars contend that this is a paradox that originates from undocumented migrants' lack of citizenship or lawful residence. Critical migration scholars attribute this to the condition of deportability that is being imposed on undocumented migrants by deportation regimes that states and immigration laws create. My argument, however, is that this paradox emerges from the interplay between migration regimes, and now I add this particular word to explain their mandate that is tightening the border, and now I call it neo-colonial imperative of migration laws to tighten borders on the one side, and then on the other side, the global capitalist market's demand for cheap labor. So this is this interplay between migration regimes and immigration laws to tighten borders to protect territories of the nation states. And at the same time, there is this imperative coming from the capitalist market that needs and builds on the cheapened labor of undocumented migrants. From this perspective, my thesis is that human rights regulations, by normalizing this interplay and reinforcing the illegalization of undocumented migrants' employment whose residence is not to be regularized because regularization is so very exceptional and conditioned on them being in the first place recognized as victims. These actually processes effectively dispossess undocumented migrants of their natural capacity to autonomously control, exchange, and monetize their bodily labor. This process of labor dispossession is both neo-colonial and capitalist in nature and must be resisted through legal, political, and moral means. And one potential avenue for such resistance, as I argue in my thesis, is the unionization of undocumented migrants workers who have clear share in the European economy and in the European labor force, in the body of the European labor force. That would enable them basically to claim the right to work independent of the residency status as agents, as workers, not as undocumented migrants in the first place. At this point, let me very briefly explain what dispossession is. So dispossession as a concept refers to seizure of property by the state or public authorities. It presupposes rightful possession of a form of property that the owner has become dispossessed of. To relate this concept to labor power and labor relations, it is crucial to elucidate how individuals are in possession of their labor power. Labor power is generally defined as a mental or physical human capacity that inserts value into a commodity. This definition is built on two premises. Labor power, in the first place, is a capacity that is embedded in the human body. Moreover, labor power adds value into a commodity, a value that was previously absent. From a legal point of view, the question is who owns the value that labor power adds to a commodity and how this ownership could be legally claimed. Human persons could claim ownership over the labor power if two conditions are met. Under the rules of market economy and value creation, a human person in the first place must own the labor power that exists in their body. Since this condition presupposes one's ownership of their body, its fulfillment draws a categorical distinction between free persons who own their bodies and persons who do not, enslaved persons. Secondly, the person in question must be able to sell their labor in exchange for money or any form of commodity. Under this condition, human persons must be free to exchange their labor power for money. According to the basic principles of ownership, one's possession of a thing or a capacity constitutes the power to control it. This power to control could appear in the form of the power to sell, exchange, lend, or donate. This is precisely in the same way that David Harvey highlights that the second condition of labor ownership refers to the basic level of freedom in the form of formal absence of any obstacle that could enable a person who owns their body and henceforth the labor power that is therein to sell it, to own it, and exercise the rights of ownership over it. Evidently, ownership of labor power relies on the factual and simultaneous establishment of both mentioned conditions. This is because the ability to work without possessing bodily labor power, or the possession of bodily labor power without the ability to exchange it for money, renders one's claim of ownership of their labor power void. Following this analytical framework, I would like to highlight that the legal obstacles specified under the European regime of human rights incapacitate undocumented migrants to monetize and sell their labor power in the market. These legal provisions make undocumented migrants devoid of the capacity of taking autonomous control of their labor power and exchanging it for money. In fact, these regulations render the second condition of one's ownership of their labor power dysfunctional. For one who cannot exchange their labor power freely in the market do not have their capacity of laboring, the capacity of bodily laboring at their disposal. And the outcome of such incapacitation and dispossession is a condition of loss or deprivation of what could otherwise enable people, undocumented migrants here, to earn livelihood. This is based on this reasoning that my main argument, which is legal but also political and moral, is that even if the European states could claim their exclusive right to control their borders, which in effect means the right to admit, regularize, or deport migrants, they cannot dispossess migrants who live in their territory of their natural capacity of controlling their bodily labor through illegalizing their employment. More significantly, I must highlight that dispossession of body and bodily labor of subaltern groups has its roots in the history and logic of colonialism. Long before the mass exploitation of workers in European factories and lands, the colonialists benefited from expropriation of people's bodies in the New World. Normalization of European migration regulations to dispossess undocumented migrants' capacity of laboring follows a similar logic. By the same token, I emphasize that the European regime of human rights cannot normalize such dispossession because dispossession has been the central logic of colonialism, which the European human rights regime of migration, inasmuch as it, as long as it inherits this logic and normalizes it through endorsing immigration regulations that illegalize the employment of migrants. So it is also following the same logic and therefore does not actually fulfilling its commitment to absolute prohibition of slavery, also in its newly emerging forms. This is basically the central argument that I have developed in my thesis, and based on that I argue that it is necessary that the fight to disentangle the right to work of undocumented migrants from their residency status is a necessity to respond to this normalization out of exceptionalism of regularization pathways, and that is something that could be achieved by unionization of undocumented migrants themselves as free agents who have direct, significant share in the European economy. I would like to stop here.
Costas, do you want to remark or comment on this presentation?
Yes, I did remark yesterday, obviously, during the defense, and also in writing my report. Let me just repeat a couple of points from the report that one of the great characteristics of Lindahl's work, his written work, but also her presentation, is this ability to develop new concepts and even neologisms that in a sense are being used to navigate the different paradoxes and contradictions that she has identified in the field. It's a very interesting question about the difference between paradox and contradiction. We didn't touch on it yesterday, and how those concepts, whether, with the paradox, you remember in an internal sort of repetition, while with the contradiction, you have perhaps a kind of synthesis, and how that synthesis, may move to a totalization. But, let me not go into that. The wonderful concept that Leila developed, and there's so many, like non-deported deportables. They're deportables, but they're not deported. They're illegal aliens. They have human rights which they do not have, and so on. But the one that I was really struck by was this idea, or this concept of the pseudo-legal person. Pseudo-legal person, the idea of a fake legal personhood. And, we did discuss that in the link between a kind of legal tradition of personhood that starts with Rome, and which basically, I think those people who understand the legal history understand that law creates personhood. It is a legal concept, and it's and the legal status. And obviously, it's not given just to humans. I mean, perhaps one of the earliest legal persons was the corporation, not human. And of course, today we have human rights and legal personhood, limited, of animals, and then of rivers and places of great beauty. Even gods have been given some kind of personhood, fetuses, and now, of course, even sort of technological entities like robots and so on. But then, on the other hand, we have the kind of moral and metaphysical conception of personality, which is very much, so the Western humanist tradition, that a person is someone who has will, reason, and moral responsibility, and soul, whatever, depending on the tradition you come from. And that kind of moral responsibility belongs to all humans, while legal personhood does not belong to all humans and includes non-humans as well. So that is an interest in this idea of pseudo-legal personhood. It was, for me, a very interesting concept that, you develop extremely well. And, that's something I would like you to say a couple of things more. And just, the one critical point that I made yesterday, you made it today. Unionization. We know that trade unions, particularly trade unions of unskilled labor, are not terribly welcoming towards refugees, because, they think, particularly, sort of the trade union barons, the leadership, sort of refugees, perhaps take the jobs of the local labor force, and they push wages down and so on. So, what I was suggesting, using some ideas from political theory, including the work of Jacques Rancière and his criticism of Hannah Arendt, that perhaps what we need is not just unions and unionization, but a political campaign, in which, of course, includes unions, if they want to be involved, but also includes political parties, social movements, and indeed people like us. Because if human rights make a claim of universality, that everyone has human rights on account of being human, that our basic humanity, being born, gives us human rights. I mean, obviously, this is not correct, but this is the claim that's been made. Then people like your illegal aliens and, sort of the great difficulties that they face are precisely excluded from this universal totalization. And perhaps, as some people would claim, following on from early discussion, that exclusion is necessary in order to close the totality of human rights owning humanity. But then, in a sense, they are the main representatives of the universal. To the extent that they're excluded from the universality, when you want to talk about who can claim human rights as part of this universal, as it were, sort of allegation, claim, and so on, it is precisely those people. And I think around that claim, that these are the people who are excluded from what claims to be universal, can establish a political position, a political claim, a political campaign that I think all of us, sort of would like to, would want to be and would need to be involved, because it is precisely that kind of exclusion, which is also exploited, as you showed extremely well in terms of the labor contract and the non-remunerated labor contract, which, however, they don't have a contract, but they can be paid for it, although they can also not be paid for it. You see, gambling debts have to be repaid, but there's no way you can go to court to claim the back. And in a sense, I was thinking that, legally, yes,
Natural obligation.
exactly. There's an obligation, a natural obligation. I'm not sure why it's natural, but anyway, because you won, that you can claim the money, but you cannot go to court if the other person. So anyway, thank you very much, Leila. I mean, you have really made me extremely, I think, hopeful, sort of in reading your work and in seeing you here in Amsterdam, sort of really flourishing and enriching the academic community of the city, but also, with your ideas, which I think also put great new emphasis and importance in the great struggle that we have to do today, even as part of that kind of utopian desire that never, as it were, becomes real, but on the other hand, keeps us moving along the way.
Anna, do you want to respond?
Yeah, I would love to respond, but at the same time, I don't want to occupy too much space because I want us to have room also for questions, specifically questions to Costas. So I cannot agree more with you, particularly on the second point about the necessity of even politicizing more, giving more political power to every form of resistance and struggle, to tackle the structures of inequality and violence. I just want to actually emphasize on a very, very brief point that I believe my emphasis on the power of unionization, especially when it is something that is being done and organized by undocumented migrant workers in their capacity and identity as worker, does not exclude any other possibility and potential for actually broadening the scope of resistance and unionization and collective struggle. But I think there's one particular value into it because it has, I hope, the power of shifting the discourse that is basically actually focused on seeing refugees, undocumented migrants, non-citizens in general as victims and even burden to receiving societies. The worker identity of undocumented migrants as a center for them to get unionized and claim their right to work focuses on their share in economy. A particular share in the economy upon which, the food that we eat, the houses that we live in, the streets that we see clean every day, every time is built on. That is something different. These people bring kind of labor into the societies, which is indispensable to the market and the way of life that people have. So they are agents. They are not victims in need of receiving mercy, compassionate help, humanitarianism. I think even if not at the center of the bigger political campaign, this is something really exclusively important because it has the power to shift the focus. And for the first point, I leave it here, maybe for further discussions, but then I think it's better if we have questions. And thank you very much.
So I think we should open the floor also for questions aimed at Costas and Hans. Who wants to start the discussion off? Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for this very interesting talks. I have a question. I actually have two questions. I don't know if one, but my first question is the question about the link between rights and the state, because you're all very critical of rights for good reasons, I would say. But there seems to be still this sort of utopian desire for having a sort of kind of claim rights, I guess. But critics have also pointed out that who is going to be the arbiter of those rights is going to be some sort of state. And if the state is then this sort of nation state that also has this sort of biopower and sovereignty, then why do we hold on to rights? And why don't we just throw them overboard and say, we want some affirmation of life and whatever. And then the question to Leila is, I was not sure about you're kind of having this framework of self-ownership, right, of the body, which of course comes from Locke, but there's also from Marxist critique this point about disposing your own body for work and exploitation with this concept of self-ownership. So there seems to be this tension in seeing a body as split from the subject that then is owning that body and the labor that comes out of it. So how do you see that tension from your perspective?
So I think the first question was directed at Costas, I would say.
Yeah, I spoke a lot, so I mean, let me say something at the very end. It's now Leila's time.
Yes.
Can I say something also about the first question? So rights, they're very much important, but they need to get liberated also from state. That is the point, I think. And this actually struggle, agentive collectivization and a struggle to reclaim and regain rights independent from states and power, not just as the entity, the sovereign that controls border, but also as the main actor in the capitalist economy and capitalist market is very much important. Rights also needs to get emancipated, but it's also important not to forget, I believe, that rights are the legacies of humanity, which they come from the long tradition and history of resistance fighters, people, bodies, it is not fair actually to give them off altogether at once just because the state right now has the monopoly of claiming everything in the name of rights and using it or even weaponizing it to abandon people to a condition of severe exploitability and violence or even actually to use it as a weapon for humanitarian intervention, something that you actually talked about a lot in your writings. So I do still believe in rights, and I think that could actually be the center of many forms of resistance. That is about it. But also about the question on bodily labor, I exclusively actually build my analysis of labor disposition on Marx's understanding of labor and seeing human beings and workers as living laborers and living laborers. So in that respect, of course, this is the observation that Locke also had, and it was used basically to justify colonialism. That is something. But it's also actually a ground for Marx's analysis to criticize the institution of the right to work and labor contract. But that actually criticism that Marx has is something that finds its central meaning in the context of conventional exploitation. That is what I call, actually, that's how I call it. And that is something that happens in the context of normal labor relations. So wage laborers are all actually exploitable laborers because of submitting their labor and hence their body to the power of the employer, to the dominating power of the employer. And that is something that is being masked, not just facilitated, being masked by labor contract and the right to work. However, in 21st century, we have undocumented migrants, illegal aliens who, because of not having the right to work and not having this legal capacity of discharging and exchanging their labor power in a safe way to receive money that could serve actually as a basis for them to live and have means of subsistence, they are exposed to another level and form of exploitation. So I see the meaning of bodily labors different in this context. So I think it is something. It is a very much reliable ground actually to see new forms of exploitation that are being facilitated in the context of irregular migration and dispossession of undocumented migrants, their ability and capacity to work, and that could actually open our eyes to both new forms of exploitation and also to new forms of resistance to reject it.
I will briefly add that there are some that see the origin of rights in William of Ockham, in exactly the sort of corollary to the Suprema Potestas. Are there questions, remarks? Yes, you first and then first that.
This is a question for
Yes, yeah, go ahead.
This is a question for Costas. So we kind of mentioned this notion of life as the weapon and the stake of resistance. And at the end, you kind of said that this is our hope for now. And so I guess, not to be a pessimist, but I guess that question kind of is like, where does that hope come from? Because so far, like we see all these protests and we see that the state is still trying to suppress dissent, and that it is actually like it does end up taking lives, injuring lives, and it's still able to maintain this facade of the protector of human rights. So what makes you think that that's going to change?
So,
It's a simple question.
yes. Okay, but let me start with your question. I mean, rights, civil rights, political rights, and then later, of course, human rights, were achieved in struggles against the sovereign, against the state. They were victories of working class people, of democratic movements, and so on. So to that extent, there's one first answer that, rights, of course, then they become legalized, they become human, international law, and so on. But in the first instance, in the 19th century, the great struggles, for emancipation, for labor rights, for, sort of women's rights, and so on, these were rights, important rights that changed to a certain extent, sort of the political establishment. Now, if we come to today, of course, when people go out in the streets and say during the, the financial crisis, occupations and so on, all the way to Wall Street, the argument was we are the 99%. In other words, an argument of equality, of social justice, equality, not an argument of human rights in those specific things. So I'd say that as a critical lawyer or as a critical citizen, you have to use rights, including legal rights, in the courtroom because the state has made certain promises by saying we're going to respect this and the other rights and so on. If those rights are being violated, as a lawyer, I go to the court or I go to Heathrow to help people coming in and wanting to claim refugee status, and I will have human rights coming out of every orifice of my body. You are saying these things. This is what your law says. This is what the Geneva Convention says. This is what the Human Rights Convention, whatever says, and you try to make them stick to their promises. This is an immanent critique, an internal critique in relation to what is being claimed by the state, by the law. But at the same time, there is a point at which you stand outside the law, outside the court of law, or outside the Heathrow, and you shout, this system does not work. This system violates every human value, every human principle, and so on, and has to change. So there is a type of argument and action within the law, and a type of argument and action outside the law. And many times when we claim rights in the streets, we don't mean rights in the legal sense. We don't mean that, these are rights that can be resolved by taking a good lawyer and going to the court. So we use the term rights in that sense, in a different sense, in a sense that relates precisely to resistance, to a political struggle. And we don't have another term, and the term has such a huge symbolic value, has acquired a huge symbolic value, that you use the term, so the rights, although you don't mean legal rights, the way that as a lawyer, I would understand what a right is. So that is my first answer, that human rights is a paradoxical discourse, and this is what Leila's work brings out so strongly, that, it is, on the one hand, something that promises a better treatment, mainly in relation to liberty and freedom from oppression and so on. On the socioeconomic side, obviously, so not that useful. But, so they do make that claim, and this claim has to be as it were, so forceful. You cannot abandon. But on the other hand, you have all the issues that Leila is talking about. So I will put it in one sentence as follows. I will never stop criticizing rights, but I will also claim that nobody should not have no rights. So you continue criticizing, but on the other hand, you said everyone should have, particularly those civil and economic rights. Now, to your argument, obviously, when you try to understand what happened during the pandemic, and how many people here in the Netherlands, actually, there was a number of these new forms of resistance, including people meeting in bars and saying, we want to be together. Now, we want to be together. This is what I've read. I was not here, but I've read about a number of such resistance. I don't know if you know them, sort of when they happen locally. This idea that people gather in a bar and say, we want to be together. And you're not allowing us to meet, to be together, to enjoy that, sort of great feeling of conviviality and drinking together and so on. Now, so I was trying to kind of work out, sort of what is that kind of action? And we saw different actions like that. I mean, Hong Kong is absolutely great. China, Chinese resistance is perhaps, we're not aware so much in the West, stopped, the Chinese lockdown, which was, the most intensive lockdown, and had led people, committing suicide and so on and so forth. And people started, resisting by going out, banging, so their pots and pans and so on. And eventually the Chinese government, were obliged to stop it. So when you try to theorize these things, to understand where they come from, clearly they don't come from the law. Those legal rights have been suspended. It's not that you can go up to the Chinese policeman and say, sorry, the Constitution gives me the right to protest. It doesn't exist. And it is there that, sort of, the idea of life, of a force that we all have, and which is part of the government's and the state's legitimacy, particularly in the post-war period, that, so we have the government, offers certain promises about, sort of helping life and health and the rest of it, that this, in a sense, helps you understand that when people go out without having legal rights, but still resist, clearly, sort of the normative foundation comes from the same source that government claims for its own activities, which is, I'm doing well by you in terms of your life. And when we say, no, you're not doing well by us in terms of our life is precisely what allows you to go out and do it. I know that this is an idea that has to be developed further, but I found it extremely interesting in the first place, particularly because of what refugees do. I mentioned the state crime, the Greek state crime, where 700 people were drowned, and it was the Greek Coast Guard that caused it, from what we understand now. In the next 2 weeks, boats similarly big and really, sort of unsafe-worthy boats started coming over again from Libya, from Egypt, and so on. So that kind, again, of wave, I mean, these people, use their life, put it on the line. They know that they might drown, sort of their colleagues and friends, sort of perish a week ago, but they still do it. So again, that is something that made me, sort of, first of all, despair, about what is happening. But also, that sense that people are prepared, to the extent that life has become so much the stake of political struggles on both sides, they're prepared to put their life at risk in order to try whatever it is that they try to do. But it is important to understand that the politicization of life on the part of the state, I think, opens the possibility for people on the other side resisting or trying to do good and so on to use their life as well.
Before we move to the room, we have a question from online. Shall we paraphrase?
I think there's a question for Costas regarding the.
Why do you ask like that?
Maybe I can start with the general questions about the situation in Gaza, because that's also very, topical and very important question just to address in relation to the meaningfulness of human rights in the present context, while looking at the genocidal violence that is taking place in Gaza. So what is the legacy of human rights, just looking into the future, while seeing this genocide happening, just this live, which is also being live streamed? So just general questions for all the speakers.
Listen, this is the great hypocrisy of our times. I mean, it will go down as one of the greatest, I think, abandonments of morality and value, and indeed the Enlightenment project. I mean, you know, when Habermas of all people, you know, writes a letter, you know, with 3 of his main disciples in Frankfurt, and basically says, start raison, you know, this is, you know, what we Germans believe. And these great characters, these great intellectuals, you know, who have fought so hard for the Enlightenment principles, you know, sort of are prepared to do things like that. That seems to me to be one of the really dark moments of our history. I mean, talking about intellectuals, talking about, you say, human rights, because in Gaza, you know, you have, I think everyone has realized something that Leila, myself, and others have been making more theoretically over the years, that clearly humanity is not a single unity. There are fully human, later human, and even some inhuman, you know. And in a sense, Israeli ministers have said that, you know, we kill people and not prepare animals and so on. So, I mean, you know, imagine what future generations, if that Enlightenment principle continues and is not interrupted, and, you know, we have perhaps not, you know, the second modernity or the post-modernity, but, you know, a totally alien new age, you know, which perhaps, you know, sort of is dawning upon us at this point. You know, it is not, it just does not feel, not right, it does not feel coherent with everything, with all the stories we said about ourselves. We said stories about ourselves, particularly here in Europe. And what is happening now is kind of totally outside of that. You know, there's nothing much to say except that basically the claim of humanity, I mean, we said that earlier, always includes a part of it which is not within the confines of humanity, but outside of it, and therefore can be treated in ways that are absolutely unacceptable.
So maybe I can just add to this, that this is precisely the situation that we can see the double face of human rights. So as something that was not successful, you know, to fulfill its promise, and couldn't stop actually genocide on this scale, as some Jewish scholars also call it, like live stream genocide, what is happening in Gaza now. But at the same time, I think this is a very interesting moment to see the power of human rights. And we can actually observe it when we see that there are some voices and spirits and perhaps some instruments that make it possible to bring this claim to the public that what is happening is genocide and war crime, and that this is precisely the moment that superpowers are actually showing their real face and are not ready and willing, and even, you know, so they just reject the commitments that they consider to be really something on other parties, as long as they are involved in crimes, they are involved in violence. There are always those barbers who are committing serious crimes and violence, and they should be actually accountable before courts for their obligations and responsibilities under human rights. And when it comes to superpowers and Western states, sometimes they are not even actually ready, and they are not even complying with their obligation to show and stand up before the court, when there is actually a warrant by the court that they established to pursue violations of human rights. This is the power of human rights. So we see it's double face right now, at least in this way. Yeah.
Sir, I have you in the queue, you in the back. Yes.
Yes, so for three great presentations, but I have a question for Hans, if I may. And it's a question of clarification. You ended your, if I made my notes correctly, you ended your presentation with utopia as the unquenchable source for wholeness beyond unity. I was wondering how that relates, how this concept of wholeness, or maybe you put the emphasis on source, but how the concept of wholeness relates to contingency. Because you mentioned in your text the overcoming of contingency. I know you have an article with the name Enduring Contingency, so maybe you could say something about it.
So thanks, Luigi. We know each other from quite a while back. So when I speak about unity, what I'm trying to say is that a legal order presents itself as a unity, which means that it involves necessarily a process of inclusion. That means therefore also that to the extent that it includes, there will always be an element of violence, not really for what it includes, also for what it includes. When Aboriginal people say refuse to be part of Australia, they're not saying our right to have rights. They're saying, I don't want to have rights. So in a sense, part of the problem of political liberalism, which is, I think, at the end of the day, a totalizing understanding of unification, is that it has obsessed on how we could be a more inclusive society without having an eye for in what way inclusion is itself already, perhaps to some extent, excluded. So I want to say that we will not be able to get rid of that moment of unity as being part of the fact what Costas referred to, that moment of sovereignty. But on the other hand, that precisely that moment of wholeness is, if you wish, that moment of universality, negative. There's a striving, an unquenchable desire to become whole in the face of the necessary cut that creates inclusion and exclusion. And that in a certain way, the dynamic of law and of politics is that oscillation between, on the one hand, the inevitability and the irreducibility, politically and legally, of inclusion and exclusion, but at the same time, that striving, that desire for wholeness as moving beyond that the cuts that will include and exclude. It's a nice desire.
Sure. Yes.
Yes. Thank you so much for both the presentation and your presentation as well. I have a question for you, unfortunately. I would like to know exactly what is the difference between the idea of Agamben's state of exception and the idea of legalized necessities. I recently finished almost like a book, and I have the feeling that for Agamben, the situation is not that the state of exception is like solemnly pronounced, but it's like the constant, that is, or the building blocks of the state power. And if, only when it's necessary, you have to express it, like the government express it in the declaration of the state of exception, but in general is what it is, grounding the power of the state. So how this differentiates from the idea of legalized necessity that you endorse?
You're right. You know, sort of, I use the state of exception in perhaps a more, I suppose, activist sense than what Agamben does in terms of his own analysis, you know, sort of the way political power takes over life since Aristotle and so on. So in that sense, perhaps, you know, sort of explosive. But on the other hand, I mean, going to the court cases, and there's a number of court cases in which the state of exception was argued, but it was turned down. It is in relation to that, and of course, in relation to myself having lived a state of siege, you know, and as a result of that, have been to prison and have been all kinds of bad things. It is my state of exception, my experience of a state of exception and how it worked, and what is now happening, which is no longer, you know, sort of any claim of a regime of exception, but just of, you know, the law does these things absolutely fine. So while the state of exception, particularly in its more activist and aggressive sense, was seen as putting a stop to the ordinary operation of law. Perhaps not in Agamben. To tell you the truth, I'm not a great, sort of reader of Agamben. I read Homo Sapiens perhaps 25 years ago when it first came out. So, I'm not the kind of in a position now to answer. I'm sure your reading is correct. But I know that lots of people say, state of exception and Agamben, state of exception and Agamben. The two things, sort of go together, sort of like animals in Noah's Ark. So, I thought that, this is not how I experienced the state of exception myself and how it works today. So you may be right, in which case, in Agambenian terms, we live in a permanent state of exception, but in legal terms, we live in a state of necessity, which can always be brought in and then stopped without any grave kind of sort of declaration and so on.
So you can see when people are reported from the US because they are country, for example.
Yeah. And we're talking about law. I want also to say just one word about the previous question. But of course, international law at this point, sort of has been totally, I think, sort of ridiculed. We have warrants against leaders. We have the Court of Justice saying that there is a plausible sense of genocide, and basically nobody cares. And of course, it was Putin first. Putin has a warrant against him by the ICC. Now, of course, that perhaps stops him from traveling very much outside of Belarus or something like that. But the fact is that international law and international lawyers at this point seem to have abandoned, sort of the discipline and integrity of their field. And they're not coming out to say, sorry, we always knew the international law is a kind of sort of weak type of legal system. But here it is totally ridiculed every day. Not just about human rights, about the wider conception of international law and the way in which it tries to regulate war, to regulate what is happening, during armed conflict. All that is gone, totally gone. If you go to the Geneva Convention, not the refugee, the Geneva Convention about the laws of war, every single article has been violated. Do we hear international lawyers saying that publicly and aggressively? Not against Israel, against the way that international law is being ridiculed at this point in time. I'm afraid not. So we could even say that we have a state of necessity in international law. I'm not going to go into that, but it is something very strange that international law at this point is applying through its non-appliance. It is excluded through an inclusion or included through an exclusion.
So we have Oscar Hans, and I'll take one more.
I think the last question was answered.
Okay, so Oscar and Hans, and then we will likely have to leave the room. So this will sort of naturally end the session anyway. So Oscar, please.
Thanks. I really enjoyed all these presentations. I think I'm glad that you mentioned the police. Then I kind of returned to the state reception through Benjamin. This is going to be a ghostly presence in life. So, Lena, I really enjoyed how you articulated this idea of the production of a system of exploitability. And I think, also, what I felt was lacking in your kind of historical account was police power. So an account of police power. So I'm interested in your thoughts on this.
So when you mean police power, like policai, the policai,
yeah,
or you mean police?
Policing, yeah. So
or police force.
Not as in the singular institution of the police, but in the kind of expression of sovereignty writ large through practices of policing, like border enforcement, like criminal detention, like if you're working in university in the UK, for example, you become a border deputy because you have to check people's immigration status. They have to check in, you have to make sure they're registered, you become a border guard. So this broader sense of policing. And here, well, also is blurred a bit because the actual kind of formal institution of the police and the police power, as Benjamin says, exists outside the law. So I think this seems something different to your historicization. So, for example, you seem to start to chart the kind of like the big postmodern change, seemingly in the 21st century. But the example you give of spy-offs started in the 60s, and we can also think of other forms of administrative coups that have happened that I think are also representative of this kind of policing power. So I'm kind of interested in how you develop this, or if you have thoughts on this. I thought you might maybe.
Right, yeah, I'm not 100%. I mean, you use the term police as Benjamin uses it, or as Jacques Rancière makes the distinction between police and politics. Yeah.
I guess it's something that seems to be in between your own kind of sovereign power and biopower that expresses many of the things that you identify in this kind of postmodern power, for example, bureaucracy or right to be kind of external, the blurring of the state and the law. But you don't seem to mention it. Maybe you do. I'm really interested to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I'm not sure, sort of we disagree. I mean, so I think very much, I follow, the tradition you're talking about. Perhaps in my presentation today, sort of I stayed more to kind of sort of day-to-day policing, rather than that wider conception of police that you're talking about. So, I mean, I agree with everything you said, and I would say that this is not arguing, but it is one of these. I don't have an answer. I think I agree with you, but I think this is what I'm trying to do. Now, obviously, I'm not succeeding. That is part of the normal failure of intellectual life. From Hans, I heard a wonderful interpretation of what I'm saying, and I'm going to adopt it and say that's exactly what I'm doing. But from you, I heard that I'm not doing something that I think I was doing. No, thank you very much. So I'll take it into account. Sort of next time. But I don't think we disagree at all. For me, the police powers that I mentioned in terms of specific instances, in terms of acts of parliament, laws, activities, and so on, are part of this wider type of policing, as you mentioned, which is the opposite in a first instance to politics. There is policing and there is politics. And the policing and politics are not a bipolarity, a juxtaposition. One is in the other, they're intertwined. And of course, politics involves violence, force, and therefore involves some policing as well. And policing, on the other hand, does pursue political aims and does act as part of the language of the state, which of course the main language of the state, law, but policing, it's another arm of that language of the state. So I think we're totally agreed, and I will try to take it into account.
So, last question is for Hans.
Okay, so it's just let me sit here so I don't have to turn my back to anyone. So thanks very much. It's just a comment on what Leila had to say, which I found a fascinating presentation, linking it to a comment that Costas made about the notions of fragments of utopia, and then a reference to, well, migrants are here. And in a certain sense, it seems to me that what you're doing in this paper is a fascinating illustration of the idea that, in a certain sense, utopia is nowhere, but at the same time, utopia is elsewhere with respect to the European Union. Let me explain. So in a certain sense, we have all heard the famous consideration of the European Union from the Treaty of Rome, determined to create an ever closer union among the peoples of Europe. Now, that has been trumpeted by people such as Weiler as showing that there's pluralism, that we don't want to understand Europe as being, one, that precisely the idea of a plurality is core to the very notion of Europe, the European Union. But if you actually look at what it's saying there, it's saying something quite different. But it's saying an ever closer union. That is to say, there's the assumption that there already is a union. And what that union is doing is giving political and particularly legal substance to the fact there's already a union. But of course, when referring to an ever closer union, there's a reference to a past. Because if it is already a union, then it must have become a union somewhere and someone. But when? We don't know. Where? We don't know. So in a certain sense, there's already a reference to a union in terms of a past that was never present and a here that was never here. So strictly speaking, in that consideration, Europe is utopia. It's nowhere and nowhere. And precisely because Europe does not fall together with its concretization as the here and now of a common market, because it's more and other than the common market as we have given it shape today, there's a possibility for, on the one hand, there's a reference to a Europe which is not in space and time and makes it possible to speak empirically about a here and now from those who are within the European Union and understand themselves as being European citizens. But it also makes possible that there can be migrants who say, I'm here, but where are they? They're elsewhere at the same time that they're here. They're speaking to a Europe that is both here to the extent that they're already within the European Union, but what you're showing is that in the possibility of separating a right to residence and a right to work, that they're at the same time both here within because they're illegal in both senses, but you're drawing on European Union law to show that they can actually separate them, and therefore that they are here and they're in another European Union, which is to say that that is what's precisely a fragment of utopia. So thanks very much for a brilliant presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you for the session. Thank you also for the people online. Our next session will be on June 4th with Shuyu Wang and Maluka Kuiper, which will be a cracker as well. Thank you all. Make sure that's the right.
And one.